Once upon a time, humans roamed the earth, living off the land by hunting animals and gathering wild plants. But around 12,000 years ago, things started to change. Some groups of people began to farm the land instead of just relying on what nature provided. This big change marked the start of what we call the Neolithic Revolution. Farming wasn't something that happened all at once, or in just one place. It popped up independently in different parts of the world like the Near East, China, Africa, and the Americas. People in these areas started growing their own food instead of just picking it from the wild. Different regions focused on different crops. In the Near East, it was grains like wheat and barley. In places like Mesoamerica and China, it was things like squash, maize, corn, millet, and rice. This shift to farming completely transformed human life. It meant larger groups of people could be fed, but it also led to changes in how societies were organized. People started to live in settled communities instead of moving around all the time. They also began to domesticate animals for things like milk, wool, and meat. So why did people start farming? Well, it's not entirely clear, but it might have had something to do with changes in the environment after the last ice age. Climate shifts could have made it harder to find food, pushing people to try growing their own. As they experimented, they learned how to plant seeds and help crops grow better. Some places were just right for farming, while others weren't. In Mesopotamia, southern Turkey, and Israel, conditions were perfect. This area, shaped like a big crescent, became known as the Fertile Crescent. Around 12,000 years ago, people here started to grow wheat and barley from wild grasses. They also domesticated other plants like peas, lentils, carrots, olives, and dates. In Asia, along the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, people started farming rice, millet, and soybeans about 10,000 years ago. Meanwhile, in sub-Saharan Africa, around modern Sudan, they began cultivating sorghum and later added crops like peanuts and sesame. In central Mexico, groups started growing maize, corn, around 6,000 years ago, along with beans, squash, and peppers. And in the Andean region, they began growing potatoes about 5,000 years ago. As people in these regions mastered agriculture, they shared their techniques. Wheat spread from the Fertile Crescent across the Mediterranean and into Europe. Rice farming spread across Asia, and maize made its way from Mexico to North and South America. But agriculture wasn't just about growing plants. It also involved animals. People started domesticating animals like sheep, goats, chickens, horses, and llamas. They chose animals that were easy to handle, could feed on local plants, and reproduced quickly. However, not everyone adopted farming. The indigenous peoples of Australia, for example, stuck to hunting and gathering despite living in environments that could support farming. They decided it wasn't the best fit for them and their surroundings. And as seen with the indigenous peoples of Australia, it's hard for us to imagine living in a world shaped by agriculture, but the shift wasn't easy for our ancestors. Imagine having less time for leisure because farming took up so much of your day. While hunter-gatherers spent around 20 hours a week gathering food, farmers often had to put in 30 hours or more. And it wasn't just any work, it was often tough and tedious, especially for women, who bore the brunt of the labor. Living in big agricultural communities also brought new risks. Epidemic diseases became more common, especially in areas where waste piled up. Plus, farmers were at the mercy of the weather. They couldn't just pick up and move if conditions turned bad. Their diets also became less varied, mainly relying on one or two staple crops and with less meat than before. But farming had its perks too. It allowed for larger populations, which meant more hands to work and defend the settlement. When things went well, there was always enough food, and sometimes even extra to store. As people shifted away from hunting and gathering, they also moved away from the equality it brought. Farming required specialization, with families focusing on specific tasks like tending fields. This led to a more hierarchical society, with some becoming wealthier than others. Successful farmers could amass land and belongings, passing them down to their children and widening the gap between the haves and have-nots. With more food available, not everyone had to farm. As agriculture spread, some folks found themselves in roles beyond just farming. They became traders, artisans, religious leaders, and rulers. Those who amassed wealth gained power, leading armies and making laws. But for those without wealth, life was tough, with hard work or even bondage. With agriculture came new gender roles too. While in hunter-gatherer societies, women often gathered food while men hunted. In farming communities, men typically worked in the fields. This shift may have been due to the physical demands of farming, leaving women to focus on domestic tasks like cooking, pottery, and weaving. Men had more opportunities for leadership and were expected to defend the settlement. At home, women took on tasks like milling grains, a long and laborious process done mostly by hand. They also spun wool into thread and wove cloth, all while taking care of children and preparing meals. Agriculture also changed religious practices. With specialization, priestly classes emerged, interpreting the supernatural and controlling resources. Religious rituals became more elaborate, focusing on agricultural fertility and cycles of life and death. And around 9,000 years ago, several groups worldwide began to embrace agriculture and build permanent settlements. These Neolithic settlements sprang up in places like Europe, the Near East, China, and Pakistan. One notable site is Catalhoyuk in southeastern Turkey, which thrived for over 1,200 years and may have housed up to 6,000 people. Houses in Catalhoyuk were made of mud brick and clustered closely together without streets. Residents entered through the roof, creating a protected environment. Excavations reveal a mix of farmers, hunters, and skilled artisans with elaborate religious beliefs. Artifacts include depictions of hunts, animals, and possibly mythical scenes like a woman giving birth to a bull. Cattle imagery suggests reverence for the animal. Catalhoyuk's inhabitants combined farming with hunting and gathering. They domesticated animals, grew crops like wheat and lentils, and likely used irrigation. Yet they also hunted wild game and gathered wild plants. Trade played a crucial role, with obsidian, a sharp volcanic glass, being a prized commodity traded as far as Syria and Cyprus. Farther south, in the Jordan River Valley, was Jericho, an even older Neolithic city dating back to around 8300 BCE. Jericho was fortified with a stone wall and ditch for protection, with a mysterious stone tower within. Similar settlements dotted the region, all part of the Nachfion culture. These settlements were initially attracted by the region's abundant resources, eventually adopting agriculture as they grew. And evidence of early agriculture in South Asia dates back to the Neolithic settlement of Mehrgarh in modern-day Pakistan, around 7000 BCE. Here, people farmed barley, raised goats and sheep, and later domesticated cotton. The settlement structures were made of dried mud bricks, and skilled artisans worked with materials like seashells and lapis lazuli, suggesting long-distance trade. In China, early Neolithic settlements along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers emerged around 8000 BCE. Along the Yellow River, millet was the primary crop, while rice was cultivated along the Yangtze. People also domesticated pigs and dogs, supplemented their diets with hunting and fishing, and made pottery and cord from hemp. Sites like Pingtashan and Bashadong in modern Hunan province, possibly settled as early as 7500 BCE, show evidence of early rice cultivation. Homes were built partially underground or on earth platforms, with surrounding ditches possibly used for water management. Similar agricultural shifts occurred worldwide. In northeastern Mexico, settlements began cultivating plants like pepper and squash as early as 6500 BCE. In the Andes, Neolithic communities grew potatoes and manioc from around 3000 BCE. In New Guinea, taro cultivation started around 7000 BCE. Along the Danube River in Europe, settlements adopted cereal farming from the Near East around 6000 BCE. And in Central Africa, farming of white Guinea yams began around 5000 BCE, later expanding to millet and sorghum.